Good morning. I'm Pastor Rick. I want to welcome you to our series, Work Matters with Pastor Will. We're going to be looking at the important topic of the relationship between faith and economics, and we've asked David Householder to lead us in this important conversation. He gave a lecture on faith and economics here at Emmanuel several months ago. It was near April 15th. It was tax day. And so we thought we'd do this again now on tax day, which is July 15th this month, so that we'd find out about this relationship. And David Householder is an author, he's a pastor, he's a theologian, and he will lead us into this relationship because first, he wants to frame the conversation around faith and economics on our relationship with God. And once we realize this relationship between debt and forgiveness, it'll help us in other areas of our personal finance and our national finance. And that'll be the focus particularly of the second session, session 8. Oh my goodness, he covers so many economic topics: national debt, Federal Reserve. He'll talk about Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, World War I, the IRS, you name it, national debt. We won't have time to deal with all those topics. Go to the original lecture on Emmanuel Academies. But we do want to talk about, again, our relationship with God, forgiveness and debt, and the encounter with God can help reframe our relationship between faith and economics, both our personal relationship and our national approach to debt. We now want to ask Pastor Will to lead us into this very important conversation. Pastor Will?
Thanks, Pastor Rick. Welcome, everyone, to Work Matters with me, Pastor Will. I'm so excited you could join us for this episode today featuring Pastor David Householder, and he is talking all about debt and forgiveness. So the question is, how does our experience with God help frame our attitudes towards debt? Not just our personal debt, but our communal debt, our debt incurred by our government, by our culture, by our nation. And this is a great episode. I really enjoyed watching it. The church has a role to play in all this because the church has had a history with debt and forgiveness. So now take a look at this clip from David Householder, and I will see you on the back end for a longer conversation about debt and forgiveness. Check it out.
I got interested in economics because I had a radio show in California, and in the 2012 election, I interviewed virtually everybody running for office. And both right wing and left wing, I realized that they knew a lot about making people afraid and seeing themselves as the solution to that. They're very good at getting elected, very good at their, kind of like Jehovah's Witnesses, they're on their little stump speech. But they didn't understand anything about economics, and that bothered me because I thought, they should know something since they're going to be running much of the economy and setting policy. So I started dabbling in economics, and I became an economics nerd. And so if anybody for lunch wants to take me out and talk about the difference between Hayek and Keynes, I'd be glad to do that. So we're not going to go there today. We're going to look at debt. If you didn't see yesterday's talk, please look it up. You can watch it. It was more specifically on taxes. Today we're going to talk about government debt, which is what causes taxes. I like to look at the root causes of things, much like Pastor Rick on Sunday in the sermon was going at root stuff in the Bible passage, not just looking at the peripheral stuff, but what's really causing this text to come out. So we're going to look at debt, government debt. We're going to start with Exodus 22:25, and the Bible talks a lot about debt. The Bible also talks a lot about taxes. Yesterday we looked at the 5 main Bible passages on taxes, and the Bible is not of one mind with taxes. If Samuel and the Apostle Paul were to get together and talk about taxes, they would probably come to blows because they disagreed about it. And there's a lot of tension in the Bible when it comes to taxes. So we're going to look at Exodus 22:25, and it says this: if you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. You take your neighbor's cloak and pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down. Or it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as a cover. And what else shall that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. And that's one of the first things we see about debt in the Bible. And we're going to look at some theoretical stuff. We're going to look at the main theme of government debt. And so I'm going to specifically hone in on that, because that's what brings taxes about in the first place. And I'm going to ask the question, is a massive government debt really just one generation stealing from the generations that are coming? Because we're burdening the next generations with a massive debt. And what are the ethical implications of that? So I just want to talk a little bit about debt in general before we get started. In many Indo-European languages, the word for guilt and debt are the same word, much like the words for healing and salvation are often the same word. So we have two words for that in English. We have two words for everything in English. You're a knight or you're a cavalier. We've got two words for everything. We have French words and German words. But for instance, my wife is Dutch, and the word is schuld, which means debt, and it also means guilt. Mijn schuld, by guilt, my guilt. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. I am indebted somehow. And so deep in our cultural thinking, I'm not sure how it works in Spanish, but deep in our cultural thinking, guilt and debt are sort of connected. And there's a sort of primordial debt thinking that somehow we are born in debt. We call that original sin or other things. We're somehow born owing something to the people who came before us, who built all this stuff, dug the wells that we're drinking from, built the roads that we're driving on. Somehow we owe them something. We owe our country something. We are indebted to our parents for bringing us up, so we need to be ancestors for other people who come later. There's that sense, and if you don't believe me, go to any Lutheran worship service, and before you get started with anything, you have to deal with schuld, with debt, with guilt. And you get up in front and you start talking about, guilt, and you do a confession of forgiveness. And they do a really bizarre liturgical thing sometimes. We do confession, then forgiveness, and the next thing you say is, Lord, have mercy. So you've just been let off, but then you go back into the hole again, as you like for a second car wash, as you come through this whole thing. So that's liturgically bizarre, psychologically, to do that, but we do. And I was actually chilled at Augustana Lutheran Church in Minneapolis. I was there for a service 20 years ago, and this older pastor with gigantic arms, he was this big, tall guy, and he led us through the confession of forgiveness with this booming voice that makes Pastor Stephen's voice look small. He's got a big voice. Boom, 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 boom. And he comes up, and at the end he says, "My brothers and sisters, now your forgiveness is up to date." In other words, you've made your payments. You've kept up your insurance payments. It was chilling in a way, because what happens if you don't keep them up? What happens if you die on Tuesday before the Sunday thing comes up? And Lutherans doing the confession of forgiveness at the beginning of the service in some ways runs counter to our main teaching. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what Jesus did for us, where that leads us, and why then do we have to keep going through the car wash if the cross did this. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're going to talk about here with guilt, but there is a sense of primordial guilt. If I were an evangelist and I wanted to get people saved in a big meeting, I would key into primordial guilt. Don't you feel horrible for some of the things you've done? You just sink the hook. And most people, it's me. I'm terrible. There's horrible things. And so Nicky Gumbel, who did the Alpha Course, has a hilarious thing. He said somebody once sent a telegram out to his rich friends in England. All is discovered. Whatever. And people left the country over this. They were so worried that these people would find out what they'd done that they just left the country. And so people have a sense of primordial guilt that we can play into. Who thinks that churches can manipulate that? Religions can manipulate that. Unless you bring the right animal to the sacrifice, unless you keep this up, you end up behind on your payments. And then you go to the bad place when you die, or somewhere in between where you have to pay it off, like a mortgage. So there's a whole bunch of stuff we're dealing with here with guilt and how we look at guilt, how we look at debt, and guilt and debt are very closely connected to each other. Divine right kings started showing up in Europe in the Middle Ages and especially the modern time, especially in France, Louis XIV and the whole thing. And they would take over primordial debt from the church. We're in charge now, since I'm the Sun King, you would say, and I can help you pay that off by charging you taxes. And there were all kinds of ways that this sort of handoff happened into the nation state. So this whole primordial debt thing got carried on because it's such good business. It really does. It's a great business, making people feel guilty. And you can do that as a government too. You owe the king because of what he's done. You owe the prince because he's protecting you. You owe whatever. You owe this to your country to do this thing. So, let's look a little bit more at this. Sacrifices replenish the credit of the living. There's a sense to which the sacrificial system, like the Old Testament thing, replenishes the credit that people have. And you send people through the confession and forgiveness at the beginning of the service, and they feel like it's been replenished. There's a psychological shift that happens there. Now I feel better. Now I can take communion. My mother would always clean the house before the cleaning lady came. And she'd always fix her hair before she went to the beauty shop on Saturday. And it's the same thing. Folks, I mean, you have to go to confession to take communion. Didn't Jesus say this cup is for the forgiveness of sins? Well, then you've got to have sins. Martin Luther says you've got to believe this is for you. And the idea that you have to confess your sins and get them forgiven first, then get your sins forgiven. We've got triple car washes going on to deal with primordial guilt. And it's good business. The more you key into that guilt, the more you can build sometimes a church empire. You can do that. A religious empire, should I say. Not just Christians. This happens in every system. Happens with Hindus, happens with Buddhists, happens with Muslims, the whole thing. So, sacrifices replenish the credit of the living. Your forgiveness is up to date. Now, Paul and Luther, the Apostle Paul and Luther, both had collisions with the living God. Now, these weren't intellectual collisions. These were big collisions. Paul on the road to Damascus. This was a car wreck. This was a semi hitting a semi. This was a big thing. And he repeats it over and over in his testimony. Martin Luther also, who was part of this whole system where you have to confess everything. He was a monk. Went through this whole guilt car wash thing and wore out his confessors because they just said, stop it. Go get a life. Go do something. And he would just say, well, what happens if I miss payment? And he had a collision with the living God. And lots of different ways of looking at that collision. But here's what happens in the collision with Paul, with Luther. When you encounter the absolute, I mean, I'm not talking about an idea of God, I'm talking about running into God. Like we were talking about the born again thing yesterday, when we get renewed by God's presence. When you're in God's presence, you realize that there can be no debt. When you're in God's presence, when you're sitting on God's lap, you don't feel guilty. You feel one with God. And you realize you can't owe God anything because he has everything. And you can't realize that till you're with him. When you're in God's presence, he's not an idea. He's a person. And you're with God, you realize God doesn't need your payments. God is everything and fills you with grace. It's an experience of grace. We have means of grace in the Lutheran Church, and the idea of means of grace is so people can experience that, not that they can make their payments. We want people to experience. Who here has been surprised by God at communion? You're just having a day, you walk up there just like everyone else, Jesus shows up. We talk about real presence. Our whole church should be set up to create those kind of experiences. Who here has shed a tear during a baptism? Because you sense God's presence. When the word is preached, yesterday I was sensing God's presence. When the word is read, Lutherans want to bring people into an experience of grace. That's why we have the means of grace. And yet sometimes we still do the car wash thing. Because when you feel God's presence, you realize he doesn't need anything. He's pure love. And you're in his presence and he delights in you. And all the good things we do are not to pay off debt. The good things we do are out of response to that grace. And that's a big difference in our theology with some other denominations. And we miss it sometimes. We Lutherans can become some of the most legalistic people around when we forget about that.
Amen.
We can become incredibly legalistic when we forget about the encounter. And it's the encounter with God where we experience his lack of need. And his lack of need for us to do anything to make him have a better day. There's nothing you can do to change God's mood. He's always going to, he's not worried about this thing that's going on now either. He's not fearful. God can't give us anything he doesn't have. And so God is full of joy, all of the fruit of the Spirit, all of those things. And if we want to get through this crisis, which is very real, by the way, we want to align with whose thoughts? God's thoughts. And we do that by not having anxiety, by having a sense of confidence and joy and response to the kind of things that God does for us. And so Lutheranism is really all about providing opportunities for people to encounter God, so they can experience grace over and over.
Well, what'd you think about that? What a great video from David talking about the church's role in this idea of this relationship between debt and forgiveness. It's God's presence in the gifts that God gives us, both word and sacrament. This experience of grace when we experience the presence of God in worship or in our daily lives, that has the ability to transform our debt, our guilt, both individually, together as a family, and overall as a culture, as a society. And you know, we Lutherans are pretty good at that. We've got a long history with Martin Luther and the Reformation. I don't know if you've caught that little tidbit of David talking about how Luther wore out his confessors. But we know that these gifts from God, the gift of baptism and Holy Communion and worship itself, are gifts that help us be drawn into God's presence and feel that overwhelming grace. And we know that has the ability to transform our society and the way we treat one another. Thank you so much for watching this episode. We have part 2 coming of David Householder next week, so I hope you tune in for another episode of Work Matters with Pastor Will. Take care. God bless.